Now, if the body core temperature rises, it is necessary to instigate cooling mechanisms to cool the body down. Otherwise, the body could get hotter and hotter, and the person would become hyperthermic. So one thing that happens is that the behaviour of the person changes. Another thing that happens is you get peripheral arterial vasodilation. The peripheral arteries will get wider. As well as that, there'll also be a peripheral venodilation. The peripheral veins will get wider. Of course, when we get hot, we sweat to cool ourselves down. And one problem with sweating is that an individual can become dehydrated, a lack of water in the body. And the efficiency of sweating, as we'll see later, is also determined by the ambient humidity. Ambient means the conditions currently existing in the environment at the particular time. So let's think about those points now in a bit more detail. Now, when someone's too hot, they're going to behave in a different way. They're often going to feel lethargic, so they're not going to want to run around and generate more heat. So they often sit quietly, and we seek out a cool place. So there's a nice cool breeze, we'll go and stand in it. If there's some water, we might splash it on ourselves. All these things that are quite natural. And another point that's interesting is when people are too hot, they naturally tend to spread out. Especially if they're asleep, they'll like spread out on the bed and they'll be all sprawled out and in an open position. And the reason for this is it's maximising the surface area of the body. Remember before we talked about surface area to volume ratio? Well, if you spread out, you're going to increase your surface area. Whereas if you're all curled up and parts of the body are folded up against each other, then you've got less surface area. So when we're too hot, we tend to spread out to increase surface area. But the next mechanism to talk about is peripheral vasodilation. Now, you'll probably remember from other videos or from previous learning about the blood supply to the skin. Arterioles will supply blood to capillary networks. Capillary networks will perfuse the blood through the surface of the skin. That's why in white people the surface of the skin looks pink. In dark-skinned people, the palms of the hands look pink, and the lining of the eye looks pink as well. The undersurface of the conjunctiva looks pink, and mouth and lips and mucous membrane look pink. Fingernail beds look pink, but the reason they look pink is because red blood is passing through the capillary networks that perfuse those tissues. So let's think about the surface of the skin. Imagine this is the surface of the skin. There. Then we have a blood vessel carrying blood into it, an arteriole. An arteriole breaks down into networks of capillaries. I'll just draw 2 capillaries today. And then that drains via a venule. So this is an arteriole taking blood into the capillary network. The blood is going through the capillary network, perfusing it. As it goes through, of course, oxygen can be delivered up to the cells, nutrients can be delivered to the cells, tissue fluid can be formed, tissue fluid is reabsorbed at the venous end of the capillary. There's a whole host of things going on here. Carbon dioxide will be diffusing from the cells into the blood to go back into the systemic circulation to be exhaled via the lungs. So we've got an arteriole, we've got the capillaries, millions of capillaries of course, millions of capillaries. Then the blood is draining via a venule. Now the key thing to notice here is that there is a sphincter before the capillaries. Now a sphincter, you might remember, is a ring of muscle. It is able to contract, it is able to relax. When it contracts, it gets smaller. When it relaxes, it'll dilate. So there's a ring of capillaries round about the arteriole here. Sorry, a ring of muscle, not a ring of capillaries. A ring of muscle, forming a sphincter all the way around. And when that sphincter contracts, that's going to reduce the lumen of the arteriole there. If you reduce the lumen of the arteriole, less blood is going to get into these capillaries. So when the individual is too hot, the autonomic nervous system, controlled by the hypothalamus, is going to send messages to this precapillary sphincter telling it to relax. That will cause it to dilate. So when we're too hot, the precapillary sphincters will dilate. This will bring about a peripheral vasodilation. That will make the lumen of the arteriole wider, and that will mean that more blood from the arterial system is able to get into the surface capillaries. The person will become flushed and reddened. Now the point here is that warm blood from the core of the body is going to go to the surface capillaries. And the warm blood is going to transport heat with it. That means there'll be a lot of warm blood carrying heat near the surface of the body. And heat is lost through the surface of the body. So heat is going to be lost from this warm blood into the environment round about. This will only work efficiently actually when the ambient temperature is lower than the blood temperature. The blood temperature typically being 37, 38, 39 degrees centigrade if the person is too hot. Now, when someone is too cold, the opposite effect will happen. There will be a peripheral vasoconstriction. The precapillary sphincters will constrict, tighten up. That will make the lumen of the arteriole more narrow. That will mean less blood will get into the surface capillaries. Therefore, less heat will be lost from the surface of the body. The question is, of course, where does this blood go? It's got to go somewhere. And the answer is that between the arterioles and the venules, underneath the dermis, this is actually, so remember the skin has got the epidermis on top, then the dermis underneath, and then subcutaneous tissues. So underneath the dermis, in the subcutaneous tissues, there's actually blood vessels which connect directly connect the arterioles to the venules. And these vessels are called shunt vessels. They're actually arteriovenous anastomoses. They connect arteries and venous vessels, but I call them shunt vessels. And when the shunt vessel, these are actually specialised venous vessels, but they've got muscular walls. So the muscular walls of the shunt vessels, again, can constrict or they can dilate. So when the shunt vessel dilates, more blood will be shunted through here and not perfuse round about the capillaries. Now, when do you want the shunt vessel to dilate? Well, can you see you want the shunt vessel to dilate, to carry more blood through, when this is constricted? And this is constricted when the individual is too cold. So when the individual is cold, the shunt vessels can dilate, keeping the blood away from the surface of the body. When the individual is too hot, this precapillary sphincter will dilate, so you want more blood to go all the way around. That means you want less blood to go through the shunt vessel, so the shunt vessel will close down when the individual is too hot. So it's quite amazing really, you've got these mechanisms which regulate the flow of blood to the surface of the body. The more blood going to the surface, the more heat is lost to the environment. The less blood flowing to the surface of the body, if there's less blood flowing to the surface of the body, less heat is lost into the environment. So we can control the amount of heat lost or retained by controlling the tones of the peripheral blood vessels. Just trying a bit of an experiment here actually. I've just put my arm in this, it feels freezing cold, this water. So my arm's now in really cold water. So hopefully my hypothalamus is detecting that my arm has become very cold. And of course that's one of the interesting things about this vasoconstricting, vasodilating mechanism, is that it's regional. So this arm is now in cold water. And let's look at the colour of it. What I would have expected to happen is that there will be a peripheral vasoconstriction, making my arm go a whiter colour. Let's see if the empirical experiment bears out the theoretical prediction. Well, my arm looks a whitish colour there. So the cold water has caused a peripheral vasoconstriction, reducing the blood supply to the surface of my arm, making it go a white colour. Now I've got my arm in hot water now and I've given it a couple of minutes. I think you can see there's a red line where it's been in the hot water, and it's still white where it's cold. So I've now got a very, it looks red to me, you can see a line there between the hot and the cold. The whole arm is peripherally vasodilated, and my fingers are also red and dilated. The redness caused by the dilation of the precapillary sphincters. Now another mechanism that happens when we're too hot is that as well as getting a peripheral arterial vasodilation of the precapillary sphincters, we also get a dilation of the peripheral veins. The peripheral veins actually get wider, particularly the veins that are near the surface. Now in arms and legs, there's basically two sets of veins. There's the deep veins, which are deep in the muscle, and there's the superficial veins, which are above the muscle fascia, below the surface of the skin. And when we're hot, the superficial veins particularly dilate and get wider. Again, this means that more warm blood is near the surface of the body, so heat will be lost from the warm blood in the dilated superficial veins out into the cooler environment. So that's the surface of the body, and this is a superficial vein. If this part of the diagram represents the vein when it's constricted, then the blood flow through that part of the vein will be fairly small. But then if this vein dilates, gets wider, then through the dilated section of vein much more blood will be able to travel. Therefore there'll be more warm blood near the surface of the body. Therefore more heat will be lost into the environment, and that means the venous blood returning to the core of the body is going to be cooled as a result of the peripheral venodilation. What we're looking at here is a model of a cross-section of the skin. Here we can actually see a pressure receptor, and this is the subcutaneous adipose tissue. And then fairly deep in the dermis we have these structures. This is a cross-section, this is a complete one. And we're looking at sweat glands. Now sweat glands actually produce sweat as an ultrafiltrate of plasma. So it's not on this model, but there would be an arteriole and capillaries surrounding the sweat gland, and sweat would be being produced by filtering the blood and taking out some water and salts to form the sweat. So the gland is forming the sweat, and then when the sweat is formed, the sweat rises up the sweat gland duct through the epidermis and is released out onto the surface of the skin. Now, sweating is actually controlled by the front part, actually, the anterior hypothalamus. And it communicates to the well, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, maybe a million or two sweat glands in the body via the sympathetic nervous system. So sweat is sympathetic. This is why we sometimes get a cold sweat when we are anxious, because it is a sympathetic effect. And sweating really is the only effective cooling mechanism when the ambient temperature is above 37 degrees centigrade. Because if the temperature is above that, even if there's warm blood going into the dermis, high up in the dermis, in these blood vessels here, which are shown here in cross-section, then the heat won't be effectively lost because the heat outside will be as hot as the heat inside, or the temperature will be the same outside as inside. So sweating is necessary, is the only mechanism that will work when the temperature is above 37 degrees centigrade. And we can sweat really quite profusely. Up to a litre an hour can be lost in sweat. In fact, if someone's used to living in cold environments where they don't sweat very much, they can probably only sweat about 700 mils in an hour. But then when someone's acclimatised to a warm, hot environment, a tropical environment, for example, fit people can sweat up to 2 litres an hour. An awful lot of fluid can be lost in sweat. But the reason it's lost, of course, is it takes heat from the surface of the body. And at 37 degrees centigrade, if you're interested in the physics, 2.4 kilojoules of heat is actually lost per gram, per milliliter of water, which is evaporated. Now, we've mentioned that sweat is a plasma ultrafiltrate, and it's produced in the, it's essentially one long tube. But then as it goes through the later part of this tube, quite a bit of the salt is reabsorbed. So the sweat is typically less salty than the plasma. And this is particularly true if we are acclimatised to sweating a lot. The sweat becomes progressively more and more hypotonic. It contains less salt. And that's good because it means we don't lose salt from the body. And salt deficiency can be a problem in people that sweat a lot. In fact, there's a condition in England, we call it stoker's cramp, because people that used to stoke the steam boilers got it. They worked in a very hot, sweaty environment. And that made them thirsty, of course, so they used to drink. But what they used to run out of was salt. And the body became short of salt. It became hyponatremic. And that meant that they got muscle cramps. And people who lose salt still get muscle cramps through the hot, sweaty environment. So the problem with sweating is it's a very effective mechanism, but water and salt are lost from the body. Let's look now at why it is that the body is prepared to lose all this valuable water and salt in order to sweat. Why is sweating such an effective cooling mechanism? Just going to draw a diagram here, the surface of the skin. Remember, the junction between the dermis and the epidermis is wavy. And here's a sweat gland duct. Actually, the epidermal tissue goes down into the sweat gland, but I'm not going to draw that on this diagram. And the sweat gland is a tube that coils around like this. Basically a long coiled tube. And it's supplied with an arteriole, capillaries, and a venule, because the sweat is actually produced from the blood which is passing through. The sweat is produced and passes up the sweat gland duct. Today's sweat's green, I'm afraid. I'm drawing it green. And it goes up the duct onto the surface of the body. So the sweat goes onto the surface of the body. Now the thing we've mentioned is that we lose water and salt doing this. And when we sweat a lot, we can become dehydrated fairly quickly. So in a hot environment, as we've said, if we lose a litre of sweat in an hour, the blood only contains about 3 litres of fluid. I know there's 5 litres of blood, but a lot of that's cells. So, we can deplete the volume of the plasma fairly quickly. That'll be replaced, of course, because we've got about 10 litres of fluid in the interstitial fluids, in the body fluids, in between the cells, in the tissues. And as well as that, there's about 30 litres of fluid in the cells, intracellular fluid. But nevertheless, the fact that remains that sweating can cause dehydration, and of course dehydration ultimately is going to cause death. But the body is prepared to do this, and this is why. First we need to do a bit of physics actually. When water evaporates, it changes from being a liquid to being a vapour. And it requires quite a lot of energy to change states. So when water evaporates from being a liquid to being a vapour, a lot of energy is required to facilitate that change. The way I think of it is all the water molecules have got loose bonds with each other when they're in a liquid. And then for these bonds to separate, you need energy to pull that apart. And then of course when they're separated, they can go off as a vapour. So a lot of energy is required to vaporise water. This is referred to as the latent heat of vaporization. Latent means hidden. So it's the hidden heat of vaporization. So when water evaporates from the surface of the body, a lot of heat is extracted from the surface of the body to power that process. Because remember, heat is a form of energy. So the energy required to supply the latent heat of vaporization, to vaporize the water from the liquid state into the vapor state, is extracted from the surface of the body as heat. And as we've seen, a lot of heat is required to evaporate a relatively small amount of water. So evaporation extracts large quantities of heat from the surface of the body. And people can tolerate remarkably hot environments as long as the environment is reasonably dry, as long as there is a reasonably low ambient humidity. Because the higher the ambient humidity, the more difficult it is for the sweat to evaporate, because it's losing water into an environment which is already moist. The difference is less. But if the atmosphere is dry, then the sweat can evaporate very quickly and very readily. So even in a very hot environment, maybe 40 or even 45 degrees centigrade, people can actually keep cool reasonably effectively. As long as they've got lots to drink, of course, so they can sweat all the time, but as long as the sweat can evaporate. But whenever people are in a hot environment where they can't sweat, or that sweat can't evaporate, then hyperthermia is a risk. This occurs in hot environments which are very humid. Some tropical jungle environments, for example, are like this, with a very high humidity, as well as a high temperature. And the other time it happens is when people are exercising or in hot environments, but they're wearing a lot of clothes. And the clothes don't allow the sweat to evaporate. Again, this can cause life-threatening hyperthermia. So it's very, very important for healthy people that their sweat can evaporate to keep them cool in hot environments. So the sweat is deposited on the surface of the body, and in order for the sweat to evaporate, the latent heat of vaporization is extracted from the body. Quite large quantities of heat. That keeps the body cool, and the returning blood to the core of the body is going to be cooled.